We're looking at a story that, if accurate, could mark a stunning turn inside Russia's war machine. Reports suggest that nearly 250,000 Russian workers are turning against President Vladimir Putin as the very industry sustaining the war effort edges toward bankruptcy, triggering mass layoffs across Moscow and beyond. Now, what does that mean? It means the promises of stability, power, and endless economic endurance are colliding with reality. Russia's war economy, built on state contracts, rapid militarization, and forced industrial expansion, may finally be cracking under its own weight. When 250,000 workers start losing jobs in sectors the Kremlin labeled untouchable, it isn't just an economic problem. It is a political earthquake. Massive layoffs shaking Moscow's war industry have become one of the most alarming developments emerging from Russia's wartime economy, and the scale of the crisis is nothing short of staggering. When you hear that an estimated 250,000 workers, people directly tied to defense production, are reportedly losing their jobs, it immediately raises one urgent question. How does a nation at war begin laying off the very workers responsible for sustaining its war machine? That shock alone is a hook that pulls global attention toward Moscow's industrial sector, exposing a deeper economic fracture that many experts suspected, but few believe would explode so quickly. For years, the Russian government projected the image of an untouchable and ever-growing war economy, insisting that defense factories were operating with limitless resources, limitless demand, and limitless endurance. But these layoffs tell a very different story, one that is far more fragile, far more unstable, and far more revealing about what is happening behind closed doors. Inside factory floors once buzzing with activity, workers describe a sudden halt in production, machines left idle, supervisors unable to provide clear answers. Some employees reported receiving partial payments, while others received none at all, creating a sense of fear and uncertainty that spreads far faster than any official statement can contain. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. Industries that were once portrayed as the pride of Russia's wartime strength are now showing signs of bankruptcy, overextension, and complete financial exhaustion. It raises the uncomfortable reality that the Kremlin may have overestimated its industrial capacity or underestimated the long-term financial strain of sustaining a war-driven economy. What makes this wave of layoffs even more powerful is its political undertone. These workers are not from small, obscure industries. They are part of the defense sector, the very sector Putin emphasized as central to national security. And when workers in such a strategically important field lose their livelihoods, the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. Many of them believe that no matter what happened elsewhere in the economy, their jobs were safe. To see that belief collapse so suddenly is a shockwave in itself, creating frustration, resentment, and a brewing sense of betrayal that spreads rapidly through communities dependent on defense sector income. In conversations circulating among Russian citizens, a recurring sentiment emerges. If even the war factories are failing, what does that mean for the rest of the country? This growing question is becoming a hook that pulls ordinary people into political discussions they once avoided. The layoffs are not just an economic event, they are a psychological one, planting seeds of doubt about the strength, direction, and credibility of the leadership guiding the nation through wartime. For a government that relies heavily on controlling public perception, that kind of doubt is dangerous. Financial analysts observing the situation suggest that the problem stems from a combination of overproduction, mismanaged contracts, supply shortages, and unrealistic government projections. Defense companies expanded too quickly, hiring aggressively under the assumption that high-intensity demand would last indefinitely. But as international sanctions tightened, revenue streams narrowed, and resource prices fluctuated, many factories simply couldn't maintain operations. Without constant government injections of cash, they had no buffer left. This has left thousands of skilled workers, engineers, technicians, welders, machinists, without jobs in industries that were supposedly shielded from instability. The suddenness of the layoffs adds another layer to the crisis. Workers describe the experience as if a switch were flipped overnight, moving from full-time overtime shifts to complete shutdowns. That kind of dramatic reversal doesn't just disturb economic normalcy, it destroys trust. And when trust erodes among the very people responsible for maintaining the country's war production, the long-term consequences are profound. Global observers now watch closely because mass layoffs at this scale within a war-dependent industrial sector do not remain a domestic issue for long. They ripple outward, influencing politics, strategy, morale, and international perception in ways that no government can fully control. The economic strain now challenging the Kremlin's war narrative has become one of the most revealing cracks in Russia's internal stability, and the contrast between what is happening on the ground and what the government claims could not be more dramatic. For years, the Kremlin has worked tirelessly to project a single unwavering message. The war economy is strong, the nation is united, and Russia is fully capable of sustaining its military ambitions without faltering. But when large-scale layoffs hit industries that were supposed to symbolize national strength, that narrative suddenly becomes harder to maintain. This tension between official confidence and emerging economic reality is the hook that has captured international attention and raised serious questions about how much longer the fate of stability can hold. What makes this situation especially compelling is the way it exposes the limits of controlled messaging. The Kremlin can broadcast optimism, it can silence critics, it can adjust statistics. But it cannot hide the experience of thousands of families who suddenly find themselves without paychecks. When workers from major defense companies come forward, describing halted contracts, unfinished projects, frozen salaries, their lived reality becomes a counter-narrative too powerful for polished propaganda to erase. That disconnect creates a national conversation the authorities never intended to ignite. People begin to ask why, if the war economy is supposedly thriving, factories tied directly to that effort are collapsing under financial pressure. It is this very contradiction that now threatens to weaken public confidence. Inside Russia, economic strain has a way of revealing truths that political messaging tries to bury. When inflation rises, when grocery prices spike, when rent becomes unaffordable, citizens feel the consequences long before official reports acknowledge them. Now, as war-related industries struggle, that everyday pressure intensifies. Families who once believed their jobs were protected are being forced to confront the cost of prolonged conflict, not in abstract political terms, but in immediate personal hardship. The emotional impact of losing stable income is profound, and it has begun to erode the belief that the government has everything under control. This erosion is subtle but steady, and it spreads in conversations at dinner tables, in workplace corridors, and on public transport everywhere official censorship cannot reach. Economists observing Russia's situation argue that the underlying strain stems from a dangerous imbalance. The Kremlin shifted enormous resources toward military production while neglecting essential sectors that keep domestic life functioning. Defense manufacturing expanded rapidly, fueled by emergency spending and wartime urgency, but it was not built on sustainable economic foundations. Now, as revenues tighten, supply chains weaken, and international sanctions restrict access to key materials, the illusion of an invincible war economy is starting to collapse. Even state-run companies, once confident in endless government contracts, are now scrambling to survive. The Kremlin's narrative hinges on a promise that the war will not disrupt everyday life for ordinary Russians. But layoffs on this scale make that promise impossible to keep. The public sees the contradiction. When the government insists the economy is strong while entire factories close, people instinctively recognize that something is wrong. Recognition becomes a quiet form of dissent, not expressed through protests or slogans, but through doubt, skepticism, and mistrust. This shift in public sentiment is subtle but potentially powerful, because distrust in economic stability often becomes distrust in leadership. International analysts are watching this development closely because economic strain is often the first indicator of deeper political instability. It creates pressure points that are difficult for any government to manage, especially one engaged in an expensive and prolonged military confrontation. And while the Kremlin has historically relied on a mixture of nationalism and authority to preserve loyalty, economic hardship tends to cut through ideological messaging. It affects people directly, personally, painfully. It becomes a daily reminder that the cost of war is no longer distant. It has come home. This is the hook that makes the situation so compelling. The stronger the Kremlin insists that everything is under control, the more stark and undeniable the economic fractures become. And in that clash between image and reality, Russia's political landscape begins to shift in ways that could have lasting consequences far beyond the balance sheets of failing industries. Defense factories struggling with bankruptcy pressures have become one of the most revealing signs that Russia's war-dependent industry is reaching its breaking point, and the speed at which these problems have surfaced is the hook that has stunned both domestic observers and international analysts. For months, the Kremlin promoted the idea that military production was booming, that factories were operating at maximum capacity, and that Russia's industrial power was more than capable of sustaining a prolonged conflict. But behind the tightly controlled public messaging, a different reality has been unfolding, one where companies that expanded aggressively during the early stages of the war are now drowning in debt, unable to pay workers, and facing the very real possibility of collapse. The sudden shift from growth to crisis is not only dramatic, it exposes the fragile scaffolding on which Russia built its war economy. Inside these factories, there is a palpable sense of uncertainty. Assembly lines that once operated around the clock are now silent, with unfinished equipment gathering dust and workers wandering through half-lit corridors waiting for instructions that never come. Many of these factories relied heavily on rapid government contracts, taking on loans and expanding infrastructure under the assumption that wartime demand would remain high and consistent. But as financial strain tightened, sanctions restricted access to essential components, operating costs skyrocketed, the money simply stopped flowing. Managers who once boasted about meeting record production targets are now attending emergency meetings with government officials, hoping for last-minute bailouts that rarely arrive. And when they do, the assistance is often too little, too late. The most striking part of this unfolding crisis is how unprepared these industries were for even the slightest economic disruption. Their business model depended on continuous, uninterrupted government spending, an unrealistic foundation in a country facing increasing economic isolation. The hook here is the sheer fragility hidden beneath the surface of what was portrayed as an industrial powerhouse. These companies built massive production capabilities without securing reliable long-term financial structures. When demand slowed or payments were delayed, they had no cushion, no reserves, no diversified revenue streams to stay afloat. Bankruptcy, in many cases, wasn't a distant threat. It was the logical outcome of a system stretched far beyond its limits. Workers in these factories describe conditions that paint a vivid picture of systemic panic. Rumors spread through break rooms about which departments might be cut, which machines might be sold, and whether the factory would even reopen next month. Supervisors try to reassure employees, but their own uncertainty shows through. The emotional toll is immense. Workers who believed they were contributing to a strong national effort now feel abandoned, messled, and used. That shift in sentiment is not just an economic reaction. It is a profound psychological break that slowly erodes their trust in leadership. People who once took pride in their roles supporting the nation's defense now question why the government allowed such a critical sector to edge so close to collapse. Economists point to several structural reasons behind these financial failures. Many defense companies increased production far beyond what was sustainable, stockpiling unfinished weapons and ammunition without confirmed purchasing timelines. Others became dependent on imported components, electronics, metals, machine parts that sanctions effectively cut off. As supply chains crumbled, factories scrambled to source lower quality alternatives or develop domestic substitutes, a process that drained budgets and delayed deliveries. Each setback compounded the next, creating a domino effect that eventually pushed many companies into insolvency. The political implications are equally significant. When defense factories, symbols of national strength, begin filing for bankruptcy, challenges one of the core narratives the Kremlin has used to maintain public confidence. A government can explain inflation, it can explain sanctions, but it cannot easily explain why supposedly critical war industries are failing so dramatically. That contradiction becomes a powerful hook for public doubt, prompting citizens to question how much of the government's economic narrative is true and how much is manufactured for stability. What makes this crisis even more engaging and more dangerous for the Kremlin is that bankruptcy in the war industry does not remain confined to boardrooms and balance sheets. It spills into communities, disrupts local economies, and sends shockwaves through entire regions dependent on industrial employment. Each factory closure becomes a story, each layoff a symbol, each unpaid worker a reminder that the war economy may be unraveling from within. This unfolding reality forces Russia to confront a truth it has tried to conceal. A war industry built on unstable foundations can only expand for so long before the weight of its own ambition drags it toward collapse. Growing public frustration toward Putin's leadership has become one of the most striking and politically volatile consequences of Russia's economic downturn, especially as mass layoffs spread across industries previously believed to be untouchable. The scale of this frustration is the hook that forces even those who usually avoid political discussions to acknowledge that something has fundamentally shifted. For years, the Kremlin has relied on a powerful narrative, one that portrays Putin as a steady, unshakable leader capable of guiding the nation through any crisis. But when tens of thousands of workers tied directly to the defense sector suddenly find themselves unemployed, that narrative begins to crumble. The people most closely connected to the government's war efforts are now the same people questioning the competence and direction of the leadership they once trusted. This moment marks a turning point because these workers were never part of the typical opposition. They were not activists, critics, or dissidents. Many were proud contributors to industries Putin publicly celebrated as pillars of national strength. The emotional shift happening among them is rooted not in ideology, but in lived experience, an experience that contradicts everything they were told about security, stability, and national pride. When a father who spent decades building military equipment goes home and tells his family he has lost his job, the government's promise of protection becomes hollow. The hook here is the realization spreading across households that if even defense workers are vulnerable, then no one is safe from the consequences of economic mismanagement. Inside communities affected by these layoffs, conversations have taken a noticeably sharper tone. People speak more openly about corruption, failed contracts, and the widening gap between government officials and ordinary citizens. The frustration is not explosive or chaotic. It is quiet but persistent, the type that grows slowly and settles deeply. These conversations happen in kitchens, on buses, at local shops, and in the lines outside unemployment offices. Every complaint shared among workers becomes another thread in a growing fabric of dissatisfaction. This shared frustration creates a sense of collective awareness that is often far more powerful than public protests. It unites people not around political ideology, but around disappointment, anger, and a sense of being deceived. What intensifies this frustration is the government's response, or lack of one. Instead of acknowledging the economic challenges, officials have attempted to downplay the situation, calling it temporary, exaggerated, or fabricated by foreign media. Yet the lived reality of lost jobs, delayed salaries, and shuttered factories cannot be dismissed with press statements. Workers see government officials offering confident speeches on television while the communities they represent face dwindling resources and disappearing opportunities. This disconnect fuels a deeper resentment, one that transforms frustration into something far more politically consequential: doubt in the leadership's honesty and competence. Economic hardship has always had the power to shift political sentiment, and Russia is no exception. When workers question why factories failed, why contracts vanished, or why support never arrived, many trace the answer back to a single source: the leadership making the decisions. Putin's image has long been built on strength, predictability, and control. But the layoffs expose a different reality, one where the government appears reactive, unprepared, and out of touch with the struggles of its own people. The hook here is the growing realization that the leadership may not be as unshakable as once believed. This frustration is also amplified by the generational divide emerging within households. Younger Russians, already more skeptical of the government, now find older family members, people who spent years defending the leadership, beginning to question it. When a worker in his 50s tells his family that he feels betrayed, that the government failed him despite his loyalty, it sends a message more powerful than any political advertisement or opposition speech could deliver. It signals that dissatisfaction is no longer limited to the margins. It has reached the core of the workforce that was once considered the government's most reliable support base. International analysts note that frustration within strategic industries often marks the early stages of political instability. It signals that the social contract, the unspoken agreement between citizens and leadership, is weakening. In Russia, that contract was built on the promise of stability in exchange for public obedience. But stability is now slipping, and obedience is no longer guaranteed. The people who forged Russia's war machine are now the same people questioning the decisions that led them into economic uncertainty. That shift may not be loud, but it is significant. It represents a subtle but unmistakable change in the national mood, one that cannot easily be reversed and may reshape the political landscape in ways that are only beginning to surface. Political risk intensifying inside Russia has become one of the most critical and most unpredictable. Developments arising from the turmoil in the war-related economy, the scale of this risk is the hook that has forced analysts worldwide to shift their attention. For years, the Kremlin carefully crafted an image of complete internal control, positioning itself as a government insulated from public unrest and immune to sudden shifts in public sentiment. But when mass layoffs strike industries previously portrayed as untouchable, that image begins to tremble. The very sectors once celebrated as proof of national strength are now sources of instability, and this contradiction is creating a political pressure point the Kremlin cannot ignore. The emerging risk isn't explosive or immediate. It is quiet, subtle, and steadily growing, the kind of risk that builds momentum beneath the surface until it becomes too powerful to contain. The most revealing aspect of this political shift is where the pressure is coming from. These are not traditional opposition voices. These are not activists challenging the system. These are workers who spent years believing that their loyalty was rewarded with protection, that their roles in the defense sector shielded them from uncertainty. When those same workers now face sweeping layoffs, collapsing factories, and unpaid salaries, their anger carries a weight that penetrates far deeper into society. It is the hook that makes this moment so dangerous for the Kremlin. Dissatisfaction is rising from the very groups the government once relied on for support. Communities built around defense industries are experiencing a transformation. These towns and regions were economically structured around a single promise: that the war economy would always need them, that their labor was essential, that their livelihoods were secure. When that promise breaks, the consequences spread rapidly. Every shuttered factory becomes a symbol of government failure. Every unemployed worker becomes a voice questioning the direction of the country. Political risk intensifies not because people are suddenly rebellious, but because they feel abandoned at the moment they most needed stability. This subtle emotional shift creates cracks in the foundation of public trust, cracks that widen every time a new factory halts operations or another wave of layoffs strikes. The Kremlin faces a dilemma that few governments want to confront: how to maintain the narrative of national strength when the institutions meant to demonstrate that strength are visibly weakening. The official response has been predictable: blame foreign sanctions, downplay the severity of the crisis, and emphasize resilience. But these explanations ring hollow to workers who see empty production floors and receive reduced paychecks. The hook here is the growing gap between what the government claims and what the public experiences. That gap is where political risk takes root. The larger the gap becomes, the more unstable the political landscape grows. Political analysts warn that the danger lies not in loud public demonstrations, but in the silent erosion of support that occurs when ordinary citizens lose faith. People may not protest openly, especially in a country where doing so carries significant risks, but that does not mean they are loyal. Quiet dissatisfaction is often more powerful than open rebellion because it is harder to detect, harder to measure, and harder to counteract. It influences how people vote, how they think, how they speak to their families, and how they evaluate future leadership. When distrust spreads through communities tied directly to national security industries, it becomes a ticking political time bomb. The Kremlin's long-term stability has always depended on a delicate balance, maintaining enough economic security to keep the population compliant while controlling the flow of political information. That balance is now under threat. Economic security is slipping, and the truth about failing industries cannot be fully hidden. The government can control newspapers, television channels, and social media platforms, but it cannot control conversations inside homes or the disappointment felt by workers who have lost their livelihoods. This is the hook that makes the situation so precarious. Political risk grows strongest in the places a government cannot reach. What makes this escalation even more significant is the ripple effect spreading into other sectors. When defense workers lose confidence, workers in energy, transportation, manufacturing begin to question their own stability. This creates a cascade of doubt that expands beyond a single industry, shifting the national mood. People start to wonder whether the leadership truly understands the economic strain facing the country, or whether it is simply trying to project an image of control while everything beneath the surface unravels. The intensifying political risk is not just a consequence of economic collapse. It is a reflection of a deeper, more fundamental shift. The social contract that once linked loyalty to stability is weakening. The foundation of trust that Putin's leadership depended on is showing signs of erosion, and while these shifts may not explode overnight, they mark a powerful turning point, one that signals the beginning of a new and more uncertain phase in Russia's political landscape, driven not by ideological opposition, but by the quiet but growing disillusionment of the people the government once believed it could always count on. A wounded Russian defense industry carries implications that reach far beyond factory walls, and the magnitude of those implications is the hook drawing the world's attention. This is not just another economic disturbance inside a single country. It is a potential shift in the strategic balance of an ongoing conflict that has already reshaped global politics, global alliances, global security. When a nation engaged in a high-intensity war begins to experience structural failure inside the very industry responsible for supplying its military, the consequences extend into every corner of its war effort. It affects troop morale, battlefield readiness, resource distribution, and the ability to sustain operations over time. While governments rarely admit such vulnerabilities publicly, the signs emerging from Russia's defense sector tell a story that is impossible to ignore. The most immediate impact surfaces on the front lines, where the reliability of military supplies can determine outcomes. Defense factories facing bankruptcy simply cannot maintain consistent production. Ammunition, armored vehicles, drones, replacement parts, specialized equipment all require steady manufacturing cycles. When factories slow or shut down, supply bottlenecks form. That bottleneck becomes a hook in itself, the idea that soldiers in active conflict may suddenly find themselves without the tools they need. Military campaigns depend on predictability, and when logistical confidence collapses internally, strategic planning becomes fractured. Commanders accustomed to guaranteed supplies must now calculate around shortages, delays, and uncertainty. Even small disruptions in production can create significant problems because modern warfare is built on continuous flow, not sporadic delivery. Beyond the battlefield, the geopolitical implications deepen. Countries watching the conflict, whether allies, adversaries, or neutrals, assess Russia's industrial weaknesses as part of their own strategic calculus. A nation that appears strong on the outside but hollow on the inside becomes less predictable and, in some cases, more dangerous. Military analysts worldwide immediately recognize that a declining defense industry weakens deterrence. It signals that Russia's ability to sustain long-term military expansion is limited, and that introduces new questions about the nation's future posture, its reliance on foreign partners, and its internal cohesion. The hook here is that weaknesses inside Russian factories may trigger recalculations not only on the battlefield, but in every diplomatic discussion surrounding the war. These economic fractures may also reshape Russia's international relationships. Countries that support Russia may view its industrial struggle as a sign that the burden of partnership will grow heavier. They may be forced to supply more resources, more technology, more money, or more political risk to keep Russia's defense output afloat. Conversely, nations wary of Russia may now find greater opportunity to pressure it diplomatically or economically. A weakened defense sector reduces the leverage Russia once held, particularly in negotiations involving sanctions, territorial disputes, or military cooperation. The global chessboard shifts when a major military power loses the economic strength that supports its strategic ambitions. Inside Russia, the ripple effects extend into future planning. A defense industry suffering financially cannot invest in new technology, research, or modernization. It becomes reactive rather than proactive, patching existing issues instead of developing future solutions. Over time, this leads to technological stagnation. In a world where warfare is increasingly shaped by drones, cyber tools, artificial intelligence, and advanced electronic systems, falling behind technologically is a major vulnerability. Russia, which once prided itself on engineering innovation, now risks becoming dependent on older equipment, inconsistent quality, and improvised production methods. This internal decline creates a hook that captures global interest. How will a nation with diminishing industrial innovation keep pace in an era of rapidly advancing military technology? The effects also spill into regional power dynamics. Neighboring countries observe Russia's internal strain and reassess their own strategies, military spending, and diplomatic stances. Some may feel emboldened. Others may feel threatened by the possibility that a struggling nation might act unpredictably. The weakening of a major power always generates instability because the balance of influence that once held a region together starts to shift. This uncertainty compels governments worldwide to evaluate alliances, increase surveillance, and reinforce defensive positions. Even nations far removed from the conflict may adjust their economic or military policies in response to what appears to be Russia's diminishing ability to sustain prolonged operations. Ultimately, the global implications of a failing war industry are far more expansive than economic charts or factory reports can capture. They reach into diplomacy, security, military readiness, regional stability, international strategy. The hook that grips global observers is the realization that an internal economic crisis inside Russia's defense sector does not remain internal. It radiates outward, affecting alliances, reshaping conflict forecasts, altering political narratives, and transforming the strategic landscape. And as the crisis deepens, the world watches not only what Russia produces, but what it can no longer produce, and what that means for a conflict whose outcomes depend on the very industries now struggling to survive. These numbers grow or fade. One truth remains: a war that drains its own workforce is a war working against itself. The world is watching closely because when economic pressure meets political discontent, the consequences rarely stay within a single nation's borders. We'll follow this story as it develops, and we'll separate what is real from what is noise. Thank you for listening.